As long as Pokemon has existed, so too has the sleep status. Even in the anime it was popular. Who could forget how lights out Jigglypuff's sing was at getting everyone in the vicinity to take a nap, no matter where they were or what they were doing. Even an Aerodactyl intent on having Ash catch him as a snack couldn't resist. Sleep is incredibly powerful. We know from the Salamence theorem that turns are everything, so it follows that a status that gives you free turns on the opponent is going to be one of the most effective strategies around, especially when, unlike its cousin Freeze, sleep can be distributed far more reliably. Sure, Ice Beam has a 10% chance to freeze, but it's an attack that usually has freeze as a byproduct, whereas sleep has multiple moves whose only purpose is to sleep. Though Hypnosis and occasionally Sleep Powder and Lovely Kiss's accuracy can be frustrating, of course. Recently, the 9th generation has banned sleep as a whole, following the footsteps of Generation 5, and this in conjunction with the many heated conversations about the contentious competitiveness of the status across multiple generations in recent years, inspired us to make this video. So today we're going to explore how sleep has existed across the generations, and we'll find out, is sleep actually broken? And since we're covering the infamous sleep mechanic, wow, I actually can't wait to use this segue, it's just too perfect. Well, you're gonna want maximum comfort when you get spored or dark voided. Luckily, our sponsor, Manta Sleep, has got you covered. Manta Sleep is the best when it comes to sleep masks and sleep accessories. Look, despite being a gamer and a gaming YouTuber, I actually am very conscious of my sleep hygiene due to having sleep apnea. Sometimes I just need to sleep during the day, but it's too bright outside. Luckily, Manta was kind enough to send us their Manta Sleep Mask Pro, a mask that provides a true 100% blackout experience for deeper sleep. The C-shaped eye cups are unmatched when it comes to comfort, as there is zero pressure on your eyelids. And of course, Manta has a wide selection of sleep masks with different functions, so there's a high chance there's a perfect one for you. Honestly, I don't even feel this mask when I wear it. Whenever I want to take my power nap for the day, I just slip this on. So if you want an awesome sleep mask and also support the channel to help us produce more content, click the link in the description below or go to Manta Sleep and use code FSG for 10% off your first purchase. And thank you so much to Manta Sleep for sponsoring this video. Sleep's immense power was clear right off the bat with the institution of Sleep Clause, the rule that makes it so that you may only affect one of the opponent's Pokemon with sleep at a time. Note that this does not apply to self-induced sleep from rest. Anyway, the idea is clear. It would be incredibly unfair if you were freely allowed to sleep as many of the opposing Pokemon as you wanted. The game would be complete nonsense. With the benefit of hindsight, this was already a clear sign that the status was utterly busted if unrestricted. So why was Sleep Clause implemented on the online simulators that have always formed the backbone of the competitive single scene, when the way it breaks mechanics of the game meant it could not be recreated in-game? Wait, you wonder, isn't it easy to recreate Sleep Clause in-game? You just don't use a sleep move if you already slept something else, right? Well, putting aside the fact that this would become a problem in later generations with things like Encore and Choice items in conjunction with trapping abilities, which would force opponents to spam sleep moves over and over, even in RBY, this introduced simulator-specific strategies that could not be recreated on cart without breaking the rules. For instance, if the opposing Starmie had slept for several turns and thus had a high chance of waking up, and you wanted to make sure it stayed asleep, you could spam Sleep Powder with Exeggutor. If it woke up, you'd sleep it, and if it switched out and stayed asleep, Sleep Powder would fail against the incoming Pokemon, because that's just how it works on simulators. The sleep move simply fails if you have already slept another opponent. However, you can't restrict the use of Sleep Powder on such a turn, because it is a perfectly legitimate move in the event Starmie stays in and wakes up. On cart, of course, this is not how it works. Even if Starmie switched out and remained asleep, the Alakazam coming in would be hit by Sleep Powder, and you would have slept two opposing Pokemon. So where did the idea of Sleep Clause come from? Well, the mechanic was implemented for Nintendo Cup 1997, the first major competitive tournament, as well as the Nintendo Cups of the following years. This suggested that the developers knew sleep to be broken, and was thus taken as precedent for implementing the clause on simulators, despite its inability to be recreated on cart. And one couldn't even make the argument that the battle conditions being simulated were those of Nintendo Cup, since that was a Bring 6 Pick 3 format, where Pokemon's levels ranged from 50 to 55, and couldn't eclipse a total level of 155 between them. However, for competition's sake, the rule was implemented, and remember, in those early days of competitive Pokemon, bans were kept to an absolute minimum. The idea of banning moves outright remains controversial today, never mind back in the 90s, and we're talking a metagame that would almost surely see Tauros banned if modern standards were even applied. Even in this limited guise, sleep was one of the most powerful powerful, defining strategies in the game. In fact, much of the lead meta and early game sequences were centered around getting a sleep off. Gengar was the fastest sleeper, but it feared Alakazam and Starmie's stab psychics, whereas Jinx, the Exeggutor that later faded out of use, and the Chansey that later rose in use were able to get sleep off safely against Zam and Starmie, yet would be on the back foot against Gengar leads. Even if rolling with a paralysis spreading Alakazam or Starmie lead, depending on your team, you might refrain from spamming paralysis early, so you could get the sleep off without your opponent blocking it through the para you yourself gave them. With Sleep's brutally lengthy duration and the fact Sleep Pokemon couldn't move on the turn they woke up, making it safe to attack a sleeping Starmie with Tauros, to cite a common example, Sleep could very realistically translate to effectively a KO on the target. So how did you deal with this? By using your own Sleep, of course, to at least even the playing field, though ensuring you landed Sleep on the Pokemon you wanted to sleep and not the one your opponent wanted to sleep could also be a challenge. This ties into another method of dealing with Sleep. You might try to switch a Pokemon like Starmie, Alakazam, or Chansey into Thunder Wave so that you could block Sleep outright. However, this was difficult for the aforementioned reason of many paralysis users being held back until the sleep had been gotten. Since that was the status you really wanted, you were allowed to paralyze as many Pokemon as you wanted afterwards if you could pull it off. So if you couldn't block Sleep or even get momentum from getting the sleep off first, a la a Gengar versus Jinx lead matchup, what did you do? Well, you generally had a designated sleep absorber, usually Alakazam or Starmie. Why wasn't that a waste of a great Pokemon? Well, because of their huge speed, strong bulk, and psychic typing. Alakazam and Starmie were actually the Pokemon most reliable at finding opportunities to wake up later in the game, and that would often be huge, since the sleeper by that point would often be out of commission and the reward of sleep would no longer be a factor. That said, a slept Pokemon was of course of lesser value while it was asleep, generally anyway. If the opposing sleeper was still around, as was often the case with Sing Chansey, one would want to preserve their slept Pokemon so Sleep Claws would remain intact and the opponent couldn't pick up another pseudo KO with their sleep move. However, in other circumstances, a slept Pokemon was perfect as a potential sacrifice to a high-powered move that would be more threatening against more valuable Pokemon. This was most commonly seen when facing the possibility of a boom. For instance, when playing against Exeggutor, you would try to switch in your slept Pokemon as it exploded, so it would simply get a 1-for-1 trade, as opposed to the 2-for-1 of sleeping one Pokemon and blowing up another. In general, you'd also much rather Snorlax boom your sleeping Pokemon than your healthy Zapdos, or what have you. Similar lines of play could be used for sleeping Pokemon to absorb a Hyper Beam, to then allow for a free switch, sans damage, to another Pokemon on the recharge turn. Sleep was generally thought of as balanced in RBI with Sleep Claws anyway, but even then it had its detractors. In addition to the overwhelming power of free turns, the #1 abuser of slept Pokemon was Tauros, which was already a terror, and it would especially make a resting Jinx pay like nothing else. Sleep also faced the problem of being incredibly RNG heavy. Yes, Pokemon is a game of odds, but the percentages of sleep alongside its power rubbed some the wrong way. It wasn't just the lengthy sleep duration, it was the accuracy of sleep moves. Sure, it generally balanced out, as Sing Chansey made up for the move's 55% accuracy by being so good at taking repeated hits that it would consistently land the sleep even if paralyzed, since it just needed one to connect. But it could be swingy in the wrong ways, like when Gengar missed Hypnosis and Jinx's Lovely Kiss connected, or all sorts of misadventures with Exeggutor, bulky but not packing anywhere near Chansey's longevity, failing to connect Sleep Powder through paralysis. So overall, if we are to look at the status in Gen 1 without the game modding Sleep Claws, it is unquestionably broken. While still one of the most powerful strategies in the game and still beholden to Sleep Claws as in every other generation, Sleep was no longer an automatic pseudo KO in Gen 2. This was on account of Sleep Talk, which was absolutely everywhere for the amazing longevity it fostered in conjunction with Rest, which it could even call successfully while asleep. Not only would a Pokemon you slept remain active and useful even while asleep, it could potentially call Rest and then control its own sleep duration. Plus, even if the RNG affected Sleep Talk meant users couldn't control their own moves while asleep, this often wasn't an issue because the best Sleep Talkers had multiple good Sleep Talk rolls into the sleepers they answered. For instance, both Hidden Power Ice and Rest were good rolls for Zapdos into Lovely Kiss Nidoking, meaning it had a 66% chance to roll either on any given turn. Some Sleep Talkers were even completely ironclad into their targets. With Surf, Ice Beam, and Rest, Suicune would always roll a useful Sleep Talk into the Nidoking it was being used to counter. Furthermore, it was no longer a riskless endeavor to attack against sleeping Pokemon, Pokemon, as they were now able to move on the same turn that they wake up. As a result, the metagame wasn't centered around early sleep anymore, and the status was far less common than it had been before. Furthermore, those teams that did spam sleep had to work to make it useful. Rest Talk was going to be a common strategy regardless of sleep, for how it made the likes of Zapdos and Raikou eternally threatening, or how it enabled the likes of Suicune to wall forever, or how Snorlax and Vaporeon could use it for boosting sets to maintain higher threat and defensive utility. If your sleeper thudded into a Rest Talker, it was useless. So you needed some sort of other strategy to make sure you weren't completely up the creek without a paddle for when your Jinx faced a Rest Talk Snorlax. Thief was a common partnership for this reason, weakening the longevity of Rest Talkers and bulky heavy teams as a whole. Additionally, the mere threat of sleep was enough to open up possibilities and plays that could systematically break the opposition down and break the game open. Your Hypnosis Gengar might not get a meaningful sleep off against a Rest Talk Raikou switch in, but it could certainly threaten that sleep against other Pokemon. Of course, sleep still had its negatives. One could potentially make the argument that it was too strong into non-sleep talkers, thereby making sleep talk too necessary to take on such a strategy. Plus, even sleep talk simply compounded the previously existing RNG aspect of it. Some rare, extremely offensive teams could use tactics like Cloyster with Miracle Berry, the forerunner to Lumberry, to shrug off early sleep against Snorlax, Exeggutor, and potentially even Jinx, letting it maintain momentum, and indeed, GSC's introduction of items would become a major part of the battle against sleep in later generations. However, this was incredibly specific and thus rare in GSC, only occasionally being used on Cloyster and even more rarely Exeggutor, and pretty much always on Smeargle, but Smeargle itself was very rare. Funnily enough, if there was one generation without Sleep Claws that could actually handle sleep decently, it'd be GSC, thanks to the ubiquity and power of Sleep Talk unique to the gen. Still overbearing? Maybe, but probably manageable, though dealing with Snorlax would become even more absurd. Then again, that'd be what your own Snorlax would be for. Chaotic though that would become. Yeah, actually it might be too much. After all, with Sleep Claws, GSC Sleep, while strong, was perfectly palatable. Sleep took a big hit in Generation 3. With the faster pace of the less bulky metagame, the frail users of the status were frailer than before, and thus a bigger risk when using the move, especially since its duration had been knocked down to a far more manageable 1 to 4 turns. Thus, Gengar was now quite reluctant to use Hypnosis, Snorlax and Nidoking lost sleep access in the generational shift, Exeggutor was no longer viable in OU, and Jinx was a decent but very risky niche pick, therefore rare. Newcomer Milotic was a potentially great Hypnosis user, nothing quite like sleeping a switch in and giving a free turn to its teammate, Choice Band Salamence, but it had plenty of other moves it wanted to use that had more consistency than the infuriating 60% accuracy that marred Hypnosis. Thus, Sleep was, while not outright rare, also not exactly common throughout much of Generation 3. It also certainly didn't help that for much of the gen, Sleep Talk was incredibly popular, mostly on Zapdos and Suicune, but sometimes on others like Swampert and Skarmory as well. Sleep Talk no longer successfully called rest, but that was not much of an issue, and when Sleep Talk was discovered to not advance the sleep counter and thus become incredibly rare, it didn't change much about the popularity of sleep, since it still suffered from the same issues. Sleep Talk would actually make a comeback eventually, first on Suicune, whose famous no-weak strategy with the type-based physical special split alongside Calm Mind meant it was very difficult to force out and therefore punish for sleep talking, but also eventually on Zapdos, who was brought in response to a sleep strategy that had arisen, that of Breloom and its Spore. It took a while for Breloom to catch on, but once it did, it took the metagame by storm, and the player base quickly developed a distaste for its ability to generate free turns, whether for its own massive stab focus punchers or for its teammates. More viable though Lumberry was in this faster paced gen, it was not a sufficient answer, not least because of the limited pool of viable users, especially given Sandstream's prominence. It was during this time that there was briefly a movement towards a ban on sleep. Nothing too organized or prominent really, but a few top players felt strongly about the move's uncompetitiveness between the power of free turns and the RNG inflicted attempts of managing it. It wasn't just Breloom influencing the sentiment either, not by a long shot. It was the long-hated Hypnosis Gengar as well. Oh sure, it wasn't popular because it wasn't reliable, but that's exactly why it was hated, because it was basically coin flip resulting in a potential get-out-of-jail-free card, bailing a player out if the move hit, which was devastating against something strong and, more importantly, fast, such as Gengar. The odds weren't great, since if Gengar outsped and slept you, as it often did because of its amazing speed, then you could already wake up on the next turn and it'd be like it had never slept you at all. But that was just the thing, where its threat level was such that even an average sleep could be game-ending. Plus, even if you tried to play around Hypnoguard by switching in a Pokemon to act as a sacrifice to sleep, Hypnosis's poor accuracy could actually save it by missing against a target Gengar would want to sleep less. As a result, Hypnoguard was considered cheap by many top players. No anti-sleep action was taken in tiering, but the sentiment sure was there. Though sleep was more limited in this gen, its power was undeniable. It was the sole reason Venusaur had a niche over Celebi, and that niche was very, very good. It certainly spun out of control without Sleep Claws, but as it was, sleep was manageable in Gen 3, though it was contentious. In Diamond and Pearl, Hypnosis was actually incredibly common, as its accuracy had been boosted to 70%. As a result, Hypnoguard was everywhere, and so was a newcomer, Yanmega, which became one of the most popular leads since it also had the amazing speed boost ability. They weren't the only sleepers either. The newcomer Roserade was getting sleep powders off and throwing down toxic spikes, while fellow grass-type Breloom had received an incredible buff in the form of the new physical special split as well as Poison Heal, and was well on its way to becoming one of the scariest Pokemon in the tier, a distinction it would maintain throughout the generation. Sleep was so abundant and powerful, especially with the incredible power creep the 4th generation had introduced, that it became a major part of the lead metagame once again. And sleepers were racing to beat each other to the punch. Breloom would sometimes run Scarf just for the fast sleep, while Roserade would eventually come to do the same. In Platinum, sleep slowed down as Hypnosis was nerfed back to its original 60%, and as a result, the move dropped from Gengar's move pool and Yanmega dropped from usage entirely. However, Smeargle began seeing uses for its ability to throw down early Stealth Rock and Spikes thanks to Spore, making it a great lead for aggressive offensive teams. Smeargle and Roserade's power and prominence eventually led to them becoming less popular, as Lumberry on Metagross and especially Machamp rose to counter them, while Smeargle more or less disappeared entirely. Roserade was still a great Pokemon in its own right though, and continued to see use, while Breloom kept on trucking. There were occasional uses of niche sleepers like Yan Yuxi, but OU sleep was pretty much reduced to Breloom and Roserade. Breloom kept on trucking so brutally in fact that long past the Latias and Salamence bans, players began seriously complaining about how oppressive it was in choking out defensive teams while still excelling against offense, and even the introduction of Latias didn't slow it down. It eventually shifted from being a problem with Breloom to being a problem with Breloom's sleep. It was too good a status on such a good Pokemon. Roserade's sleep was effective, but it wasn't nearly as effective at consistently switching in over and over and over to find opportunities, and then barraging the opponent as mercilessly as Breloom. And this isn't even mentioning how Spore and its perfect accuracy is about 1,000,000 times more reliable than Sleep Powder's 75% accuracy. Lumberry, Sleep Talk, these measures might help, and Arceus knows the Insomnia and Vital Spirit Pokemon weren't exactly viable, even for the most ardent Honchkrow fans, but Breloom would find its way around these Lums and Sleep Talks still. Funnily enough, Breloom was such a great Pokemon, it had multiple amazing sets where it didn't even need to run Spore. However, a significant number of top players consider Spore's effect on the metagame to be detrimental. No tearing actions was taken, but the outcry against Sleep was far, far stronger in advance, and chew on for a second just how controversial Gen 4 Sleep is with Sleep Claws in effect, by the way. Rarely has a mechanic been more universally loathed than Generation 5 Sleep, as it was quickly discovered that the sleep counter now reset upon switching out. Oh sure, sleep duration was now 3 turns max, making it likelier that you'd wake up sooner, but you still had that one guaranteed turn of sleep, and in a metagame as absurdly overpowered as Gen 5, it was incredibly easy to immediately force a sleeping Pokemon out with the fear of a KO, and thus Sleep more accurately than ever earned this distinction as effectively being a KO. If something got slept, it was almost surely gone. You couldn't even run Rest Talkers to absorb sleep anymore, since Rest itself was now an utterly terrible move. You would put yourself to sleep to heal, but it'd be a complete catfish as your restored health would amount to nothing from how exploitable you'd become once you were forced to switch and never managed to wake up. Compounding the ludicrousness of the mechanic was the baffling decision to allow the Titanic Darkrai in the earliest iteration of OU, where suddenly everything had the urge to hold a Lumberry before Darkrai's immediate ban. Darkrai or no Darkrai though, the player base was finally having serious discussions on whether to ban sleep moves outright. Regardless of the existence of Sleep Claws, even with the limitation of only sleep one Pokemon at a time, this status had arguably become far too powerful to be used. Darkrai's ban was convincing enough that the remaining sleepers in OU weren't powerful enough to make the mechanic an issue, and that it had really been more of a Darkrai problem. And throughout Black and White 1, this was somewhat correct. Despite the silliness of how strong sleep was, it wasn't the easiest thing to slot on your team. Poison Heal Breloom was still a significant threat, but it wasn't nearly on par with its DPP counterpart. Hypnosis Politoed could be decent, but it struggled to fit Hypnosis into its moveset. And of course, Hypnosis's 60% accuracy made it quite unappealing. Tangrowth rose to prominence as an amazing counter to Sandrush Excadrill, and its access to Sleep Powder was certainly excellent, but it was specific for its relegation to bulkier teams. The biggest sleeping threat in Black and White 1 was Chlorophyll Venusaur, which was both peerlessly fast when its Team Sun was active and a major sweeping threat. There was also Lilligant, but just about always Venusaur in serious settings. However, as monstrous as Venusaur was, even it didn't always run Sleep Powder, as many of its sets, including the most dangerous one, Growth, Stabs, and HP Fire, couldn't fit room for it. Thus, even the scariest Sleep Abuser wasn't even a Sleep Abuser half the time, though of course it was utterly terrifying in the right matchup, especially because it helped facilitate crucial trapping from its teammate Dugtrio. Then Black and White 2 came around, and Sleep skyrocketed thanks to the addition of two metagame-changing hidden abilities, Breloom's Technician and Amoongus's Regenerator. Technically, Meloetta's Relic Song could also induce sleep, but that was absolutely never used in high-level play. Anyway, Breloom and Amoongus were on opposite sides of the offensive-defensive spectrum, but both were similarly impactful, that is to say, enormously. Breloom was now back as one of the absolute scariest Pokemon in the game, while Amoongus provided unique, crucial defensive utility against some of the scariest Pokemon in the metagame like Keldeo and Breloom itself. The power and prominence of these two sleepers completely twisted the metagame into some mangled, grotesque pretzel that ostensibly stopped sleep, but very easily crumbled with any sort of pressure. The popularity of Poison Hill Gliscor, for example, seemed like a reliable method of sleep blocking until you remember that it was hardly the best answer to Breloom's boosted Bullet Seed, nor could it beat the variants of Amoongus already running HP Ice to help against Thunderous Therian. Magic Bounce Xatu stopped them, right? Yeah, Magic Bounce Xatu, about as far from a consistent, regularly used Pokemon as you can get. Sleep Talk became popular on Choice Specs Latios, as its fourth move slot was flexible, and this way you could actually turn Sleep into an opportunity to throw around some of the scariest moves in the tier. Plus, you couldn't even be punished as easily, since now Sleep Talk could now be used consecutively with a choice item. Until you remember that Latios barely constitutes a Breloom switch despite resisting both stabs, and its lack of longevity in conjunction with its pursuit weakness meant it wasn't going to be particularly useful against Amoongus teams either. All it took to work around Sleep Talk Latios was the awareness that it would try and switch in and absorb your sleep. The most reliable Sleep Talker was Amoongus itself, letting it maximize its utility in countering Breloom, and letting it answer opposing Amoongus as well. Also being good into the occasional Hypnosis Politoed, which sometimes threw on the move just for a lack of better options and for how game-breaking sleep was if it hit, making it the best option for situations where Toad would otherwise be helpless. Sleep Talk was also seen on Landorus Therian, and it was helpful against Breloom, though it could also be of dubious merit for when you tried to use Landel T against other Pokemon it was trying to counter. You want to HP Ice a Dragonite and wound up Earthquaking it instead, or you'd wake up as you tried to Sleep Talk. On that hilarious / devastating note, the player base had a collective eureka moment and refused to tolerate sleep anymore. This came largely in the wake, pardon the pun, of tournament games being decided on Sleep Talk rolls. As amusing as it was to see sleep turned against its user, you couldn't make an educated prediction against a Pokemon using Sleep Talk. You simply had to pray it didn't roll the right move. This wasn't the breaking point itself, of course, but rather tied into the overall problem with sleep. That it was too powerful, yes, and that facing it involved unhealthy amounts of RNG. That Sleep Talk punishing the sleep user could just as easily backfire on the sleep absorber past the first turn of guaranteed sleep. It wasn't just a roll of what move you'd get with Sleep Talk. It was also a roll of whether you'd even stay asleep or not. So did you go for a regular move hoping you'd wake, or Sleep Talk hoping you'd sleep and get the move you needed? It was just downright ridiculous, and sleep moves as a whole were finally banned from Generation 5 OU, making history. And once again, remember that this was with Sleep Clause in effect. This decision actually made the player base begin to question the competitive health of sleep in other generations. After the absolute lunacy of Gen 5 Sleep, Gen 6 provided the polar opposite. Matter of fact, comparatively, Sleep was now so easy to deal with, it was almost unfair. Well, not literally, of course. And nobody would be eager to rip away Sleep Class anytime soon. That might get to be a little much, but while the low duration of 1 to 3 turns remained, the resetting of the sleep counter was now gone, making it much easier to ride sleep out. Plus, in an absolutely enormous change, grass types were now immune to Spore and Sleep Powder. With the ubiquity of grasses, this meant most teams were going to have at least some form of built-in counterplay without even trying. Good old Ferrothorn, getting even more defensive use, and of course the sleep users themselves had the same immunity. Of course, it wasn't an automatic block. Ferrothorn wasn't going to stay in forever against Hidden Power Fire Amoonguss or want to face Breloom much at all, but that's where its common partner Poison Heal Gliscor came in. Sleep finally felt balanced. Sleep users were still effective, and teams that didn't have a block could find themselves surprisingly disrupted by something as seemingly non-threatening as Rocky Helmet Tangrowth with a free turn. But generally, if you wanted to abuse Sleep, you really had to work for it between the short duration and the many viable methods of blocking it. Sleep always had a presence in Gen 6 OU, but it generally wasn't at the forefront of the metagame. It wasn't dissimilar to Gen 3 OU in this regard. A great Pokemon with access to Sleep Powder, Mega Venusaur, just about never even used the move. It had too many other great moves that wanted to fit, especially when Sleep itself was now at its likeliest to thud uselessly in-game and thus take up a valuable move slot for nothing. Tangrowth didn't use the move when running Assault Vest either, but even Rocky Helmet sets sometimes chose to eschew Sleep in favor of more consistently reliable choices. Sleep was at its most notable when Sash Breloom was popular in X and Y and ORAS, later on even adding Life Orb to its game, but it was at its most popular with Amoonguss. Overall, Generation 6 Sleep was perfectly fine, though again, probably not if you got rid of Sleep Claws. It was pretty much the same story in Generation 7, except Sleep was even rarer, not non-existent by any means, as Tangrowth and Amoonguss were great Pokemon, but this time around even Amoonguss wasn't always running the move, as it also often opted for Assault Vest. The status was great if you could get it off, of course, but this proved more difficult than ever, not just with the continued prominence of Ferrothorn and Gliscor, but with Tapu Fini's status blocking Misty Terrain. The addition of the two major grasses Kartana and Tapu Bulu didn't directly hurt in this regard, as neither of those Pokemon wanted to take on Tang or Amoonguss, especially Tangrowth, the more popular of the two. But they indirectly made running Sleep less incentivizing when you were going to be taking them on so often and not using Sleep while doing so. The same went for the increasingly terrifying Superior. It did have a legitimate niche with a Spore, Substitute, Leech Seed, Focus Punch, Poison Heal set that walked all over Toxapex and was actually incredibly annoying for many popular balanced teams to deal with. However, while legit, its niche was also incredibly specific, making it quite rare, just like Sleep as a whole in Generation 7. Worth deleting Sleep Claws for? Probably not, but if there were to be a gen where you do it thus far, it'd be this one, based on what we've said so far. Though the stupidity of dice rolls caused by players inevitably beginning to spam things like Hypnosis Gengar just to try and take advantage of it would almost surely be cause for instant regret, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. At the beginning of Generation 8, there was massive controversy. Sleep Claws was unilaterally removed. The reasoning was simple. It was a clause that broke Karcher's mechanics, and that was not the way leadership wanted to proceed any further. This was done in an attempt to have Sleep banned as a whole, as despite becoming more palatable in recent generations, there were still genuine arguments towards the overpowered status, especially if it didn't have a mechanic-breaking clause that was instated to hold it back from the insanely broken form it would take if unrestricted. And to the surprise of nobody, such an enormous decision being made without any public consultation was met with severe blowback, and one protracted vitriol-filled argument later, the decision was reversed, citing the long-standing conveniences of playing on a simulator that were now hypocritically forgotten for the sake of Karcher's consistency. However, though the execution left much to be desired, the sentiment lingered among the player base, for it was logical, and later in the generation, the concept of revisiting Sleep Claws was revisited, with the argument being for Sleep's fundamental brokenness as a mechanic, and that policy shouldn't be bending over backwards to maintain the status quo that was founded on a faulty premise. It was decently supported, but thanks to bureaucracy, nothing came of it. However, it did set the stage for Generation 9. But before we get there, we'll go over how Sleep functioned in Generation 8. The lack of urgency in pushing any sort of concrete action with these new viewpoints on Sleep in mind had much to do with the fact that, while the status may have been fundamentally not something you want in a competitive game, the Sleep users themselves were rare and not exactly rocking the house down as far as OU was concerned. Dual screens Alolan Ninetales could fit Hypnosis into its set just so it might have something else to do, but even then not always, as between low accuracy and low sleep duration, the value was lower than ever, especially relative to the covers of Stab Moonblast. Beyond that, Tangrowth, Venusaur, and Amoonguss could use the move, especially Amoonguss in the pre-DLC meta, but they wound up on the rarer side. So despite the ideological kerfuffle at the beginning of the generation, Sleep wound up underwhelming on account of the users not exactly being huge parts of the meta, and or the moves being risky. Funnily enough, Sleep Claws was the least necessary in practice here. However, the issue with mediocre Sleep users was all about to change, and Sleep was going to face its greatest controversy yet. As a result of the second round of arguing against Sleep, the subject was on the tiering leaders' minds at the beginning of Generation 9. But few grumbles aside, Sleep wasn't really impactful early on, besides a few errant appearances on Hypnosis on the terrifying Iron Valiant. And these early variants were using Moonblast and Psyshock alongside Calm Mind, i.e. losing to Goldango. Still, it would foreshadow what was to come, which was that in DLC 2, Darkrai was freed, seeing OU play for the first time since Generation 5. Now, it was a completely different Pokemon. Its Dark Void had been nerfed so badly that Hypnosis was the more accurate choice of Sleep move for it. Meanwhile, its offensive threat level was nowhere near devastating by OU standards anymore. People had been talking about testing it as far back as Gen 7, when Dark Void had first been nerfed, in fact. The controversy rolled right in. Not that Darkrai itself was broken, as nobody could reasonably make that argument at all, but there were conspiracy theories of the corrupt tier leaders unbanning Darkrai as a roundabout method of getting Sleep itself banned. With Sleep now available on fast, incredibly dangerous Pokemon ranking amongst the most capable of ending games on the spot, the broken nature of Sleep was laid bare for all to see, no longer hidden behind slow grass types that, while useful, weren't exactly threatening sweeps. The presence of Sleep in OU was clearly detrimental. Even though it had such a short duration, it was just about pinning down a source. While there were those few fiercely opposed to change who tenaciously clamored to maintain the status quo, but for the most part, it was between the camps of Sleep itself being broken or Sleep only seeming broken because Darkrai was broken. Except with Sleep in its arsenal, Darkrai wasn't that much more threatening on account of all the moves it wanted to fit into its moveset, to say nothing of the hilarious inaccuracy of Hypnosis, famous for failing even consecutively. If it were just Darkrai sleeping things, Sleep might not have gotten to where it was. But it wasn't just Darkrai. And then again, that heavy RNG element was a major part of what made Sleep so undesirable after all. Whether Darkrai or Iron Valiant actually hit their Hypnosis in any given battle was kind of besides the point. It was the fact that if they hit and the opponent stayed asleep, the options for dealing with them became even more brutally limited than they already were. And that if was predicated on some nasty RNG, minimizing skillful player interaction that is supposed to be the bedrock of competitive Pokemon, almost entirely in favor of coin flipping. Hypnosis Iron Valiant was genuinely terrifying now too, running Hex alongside Moonblast and Calm Mind. A boosted Terra Ghost Hex would shred anything like Goldengo looking to take Iron Valiant on. Iron Valiant was already one of the biggest threats around, and Darkrai was no slouch either. There weren't Pokemon that exactly needed the extra kick from Sleep, and the status only served to push them into truly unreasonable territory, alongside all its other nasty side effects. They were the poster Pokemon, but they weren't even the only ones. Venusaur and Hisuian Lilligant could be quite obnoxious as well, especially since they were running the far more accurate Sleep Powder. With all this in mind, the time had finally come. Sleep was recognized for the malignant status that it was. Removing it was controversial, but it was done, and yes, that means Sleep is now banned from Gen 9 OU, and the player base generally feels this has improved the tier. No longer does one have to embark on the RNG-dependent roller coaster that is the already difficult, limited task of dealing with an element as powerful as allowing free turns in what is the most power-crept generation ever. In fact, the ban has even kicked up conversations about Sleep's place in other generations, of whether Sleep Claw should be axed and Sleep itself should be banned. So there you have it. In conclusion, yeah, Sleep is a crazy broken mechanic, and like something like Baton Pass, it's only in more recent years that we've really begun to appreciate just how insane it is. Just like Baton Pass or say Arena Trap, it's now become so clear that Sleep is broken. It seems more difficult to argue that it isn't. It remains to be seen whether other generations will follow in the footsteps of Gens 5 and 9. All in all, it is now known to be true in Pokemon as it is in life. Sleep really is the cousin of death. Thanks for watching, everyone. And as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And in the comments, I want to know, do you think Sleep is broken? Were you in favor or against the Sleep ban for Generation 9 OU? Whatever it is, let us know in the comments. Also, thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos. And thank you to everyone else watching as well. And thank you so much to our Platinum tier patrons. Thank you so much to Raven Daytona Ring, Sorazan Croxon, Stoneface Colin, Bingleton, Ray Ray, Daniel Is Beast, Glitcherton, Alex Sabo, Funky, and Chica Chihyo for their support of our videos. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.